Today we are continuing our study through the book of Mark, and last time we started chapter 10 and made it most of the way through. Today we're going to finish up chapter 10 by looking at verses 32 through 52. And this last section can be divided into three parts, and most of your Bibles, at least my Bible, has it in three different chunks, and there's a title at the top of each of the sections. And in my Bible, the titles that they put in there are Jesus foretells his death a third time. And then the second section is the request of James and John. And then the final section that we'll look at is titled Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus. So as you can see, all three of these sections deal with relationships. Jesus' relationship with somebody. The first two sections are Jesus' relationships with his 12 closest disciples. And then the last section deals with his relationship with this blind man named Bartimaeus. And we'll see what Bartimaeus can teach us about being a true disciple of Jesus. So let's start with verses 32 through 34. And they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking ahead of them. And they were amazed, and those who followed were afraid. And taking the 12 again, he began to tell them what was to happen to him, saying, "See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death and deliver him over to the Gentiles. And they will mock him and spit on him and flog him and kill him. And after 3 days he will rise." So throughout the gospel so far, Mark has kind of given us a bird's eye view of the travels that Jesus did throughout his ministry, all the different places that he went during his 3-year ministry. You know, he began in Jerusalem, and after ruffling the feathers of the Jewish leaders there, he left Jerusalem and traveled all around the area before finally returning back to Jerusalem. First, he withdrew and went to the north, to the area of Caesarea Philippi. Then after spending some time there, he traveled south. They stayed briefly in Galilee. Then he made his way to Judea and spent some time in the hill country and the area beyond the Jordan. Now we can't tell, as Mark tells us, how long he stayed in each area. But everything we've covered so far has taken 3 years. And now Jesus is heading to Jerusalem. As he walked along the road that led to Jerusalem, Jesus walked up ahead of everyone else. He kind of took some private time, took some alone time as he contemplated what was coming ahead of him. And he must have been thinking about it and that his time with his disciples was drawing short, because he pulls the 12 disciples aside again and tells them again for the third time what was going to happen. And this time he tells it to them straight. There's no symbolism. There's no, what's the word I'm looking for? Well, anyway, he tells it to them straight. There was a word there, and it just disappeared. He taught a lot in metaphors and stories and things like that, where sometimes they understood, sometimes they didn't. This time, he just says, look, we're on our way to Jerusalem. And when we get there, I'm going to be turned over to the Pharisees and the scribes. And that kind of implies, that turning over implies that somebody is going to turn him over. Somebody is going to betray him. And then the Jews are going to find him guilty. They're going to condemn him to death. But since they're not allowed to kill anybody, he's going to be turned over to the Gentiles, to the Romans. And he'll be mistreated in the hands of the Romans. He'll be spit upon, he'll be scourged, and he will be eventually put to death. But then he says, that's not going to be the end, because on the third day, I will rise again. So this is the third time that Jesus has relayed the plan to his disciples. And I still am not sure how much they really understood. Because when all these things actually happened, the disciples seemed to be caught by surprise. They didn't handle it very well. So I'm not sure that it's still not quite getting through to the thick head. In fact, let's look at what happens next in verses 35 through 40. And James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came up to him and said to him, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or to be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that I drink you will drink, and with the baptism with which I am baptized you will be baptized. But to sit at my right hand or my left is not mine to grant, but it is for those for whom it has been prepared." So are you picturing what's going on here? Jesus is beginning to agonize over what's coming because he is now preparing himself for going to the cross for us. And he tells his closest disciples, "I'm on my way to die." And the first thing that James and John do is it's almost like, "Can I have your room when you leave?" All right, it's like, "Hey, can you do us a favor? Can you put us on your right and left side?" They wanted that position of authority, that position of that high position, a position of honor. And he says, "Are you kidding me? Do you know what you're talking about? I just told you I'm going to go suffer and die, and you're asking me for a favor." I mean, that's not the words he uses, of course. What does he say? He says that, are you able? First he says, "Do you know what you are asking?" Do you really understand what you're asking? Because what you're asking is whatever happens to me, you want to be happening to you. Do you understand? Are you able to drink the cup from which I drink? Are you able to be baptized with the baptism? And he's not talking about his literal baptism. He's what I'm going to be immersed in here over the next few days. Is that really what you want? And they arrogantly reply, "Yes, we are ready. We want that. We're able." Now, I don't know if they really understood what they were getting into, what they were signing up for. But Jesus agrees, at least in part, to their request. He says, "Okay, the cup that I drink, you're going to drink from, and what I'm going to go through, that baptism that I'm baptized with, you're going to be baptized with." But he says, "To seat you on my right or left, that's not my call. Those positions are already taken. God has already decided who is going to be in those seats, so to speak." So there's two ways to look at James and John here. They're either very arrogant, it's a power grab move, and they're wanting to be the top of the disciples, or they're really showing their faith and support in Jesus. It could be that they are saying, "Look, we understand, we hear you, and we've got your back. We are going to be there right by your side. We're willing to go through whatever we need to go through to support you." And to their credit, they did. If you look at their life after the resurrection of Jesus and what all the disciples did, James was martyred. He was beheaded by Herod Agrippa. And while John wasn't martyred, he suffered a lot through his lifetime. Imprisonments, beating, and eventually exile to the Isle of Patmos, was where he was when he wrote the book of Revelation. So they were true to their word. Whatever the cost, they stood up for Jesus. They continued to preach the gospel, and they put their life on the line for him. Verses 41 to 45. "And when the 10 heard it, they began to be indignant at James and John. And Jesus called them to him and said to them, You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. So the rest of the disciples did not give James and John the benefit of the doubt. They saw it as a power grab, and just, last chapter we saw that they were getting into that discussion on who was going to be the greatest, and they just saw this as another positioning move by them, and they were upset. So here we see Jesus take this opportunity again and do another compare and contrast lesson. The lesson between the spiritual and the physical. Jesus lays out the difference between Jesus' ways and the ways of the world. He says, leadership in the world's way, they lord it over you. They're power hungry and dictatorial, and that's not my way. If you're going to be a leader for me, you have to be a servant. If you want to be first, you've got to be a slave of all. And he compares, and really, and later on we'll see he demonstrates that. He demonstrated that his whole ministry, and his last opportunity with his disciples, he demonstrates that again. Jesus had already taught this lesson at least one other time, back, like I said, in Mark chapter 9, verse 35, when those disciples were arguing over who was going to be the greatest. And Jesus said, whoever will be first among you must be a slave of all. Servant leadership. That's so opposite of the world's leadership, especially at that time. Jesus expects his leaders to be servant leaders, just as he was. Now, in our study through the book of Mark, this is a turning point in the gospel here, in the book. Up till this point, Mark was recording for us all of the things that Jesus did, demonstrating his servant leadership, how he selected his disciples, what he taught his disciples, the miracles that he performed, and the lessons that he took out of those to teach his disciples, always preparing his disciples for his departure so that they could carry on spreading the gospel around the world, the message of salvation to the world. Now, we're in part 2. We're in the finale. Jesus is now focused on Jerusalem. The 3 years is up. His last few days on this earth are coming to a close. He is focused to Jerusalem, and that's where he's heading. And that's where he's focused now. Verses 46 through 52. And they came to Jericho. And as he was leaving Jericho with his disciples and a great crowd, Bartimaeus, a blind beggar, the son of Timaeus, was sitting by the roadside. And when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he began to cry out and say, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. And many rebuked him, telling him to be silent. But he cried out all the more, Son of David, have mercy on me. And Jesus stopped and said, Call him. And they called the blind man, saying to him, Take heart, get up, he is calling you. And throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. And Jesus said to him, What do you want me to do for you? And the blind man said to him, Rabbi, let me recover my sight. And Jesus said to him, Go your way, for your faith has made you well. And immediately he recovered his sight and followed him on the way. So here Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem, and Jericho is on the way. The main road heading to Jerusalem went right through the middle of Jericho. Jericho was about 15 miles away from Jerusalem. And there's two things going on here. In that day, whenever a distinguished rabbi or teacher would go through a town, the townspeople would line the road and the rabbi or the teacher would teach the people as he walked through the town. And so a crowd gathered because they heard Jesus was coming. But also what's going on here is that Jesus and the disciples are on the way to Jerusalem for the Passover. And it was also tradition that for those who could not go to Jerusalem for Passover, when the pilgrims that were going there would come through a town, the townspeople would line the roads and cheer them on and wish them well. So there's two events here coinciding that would cause a big crowd to gather to see Jesus. And Mark refers to it as a great crowd. So as Jesus walked along the road, he taught the crowd, and as he exited Jericho and went out the city gates, there was this blind man named Bartimaeus sitting there. And I'm sure he heard all the commotion, and he asked people, what's going on? Who's coming through? And when he found out that it was Jesus coming through, he knew that this was his only chance to get healed. He had to see Jesus. He had to have Jesus heal him so that he could have his sight restored. So he began crying out, Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me. Well, the people around him are trying to hear Jesus, the teaching that Jesus is giving as he's walking along, and they're saying, be quiet, we can't hear him. And that just made Bartimaeus yell louder because he wanted to be heard. He knew this was his last chance. He wanted to see Jesus. He wanted Jesus to see him. So finally, Jesus stops and he tells the people, okay, call him to me. And when the people tell Bartimaeus that Jesus wanted to see him, how does he respond? He throws off his cloak, he jumps up, and he gets to Jesus as quickly as he can. When Jesus asked him what he wanted from Jesus, Bartimaeus says, I want to see. I want my sight restored. In his faith, Jesus says, your faith has made you well. Go. And immediately, Bartimaeus regained his sight. He was healed. Let's take a closer look at Bartimaeus and his healing and what we can learn about faith and discipleship from Bartimaeus. First, Bartimaeus was very persistent, wasn't he? When he heard that Jesus was near, he started shouting out to him. When the people tried to quiet him, he just shouted even louder. He was persistent. He had to get to Jesus. He knew that Jesus was the only one who could meet his need. He knew that he had a need and that Jesus was the only one who could meet that need. He was desperate. He desperately wanted to get to Jesus. True disciples are desperate to be with Jesus. Second, when Jesus called him, Bartimaeus responded immediately and eagerly. When they told him that Jesus called him, the first thing he did was throw off his cloak. He didn't want to be hindered. He didn't want to be tripped up on his way to Jesus. He wanted to have nothing stand in the way of him getting to Jesus once Jesus called him. Mark says that he sprang up. If somebody's sitting on the ground, there are all sorts of ways that we can get up. If you watch children, they're sitting on the ground doing something and you ask them to do something. Depending on the motivation, the speed with which they get up varies. If you say, hey, come on, time to do the dishes, they're going to take their sweet time getting up, almost like there's a weight on their shoulders. They're going to slowly get up, maybe stretch a little bit, wander around. They don't run right to the sink, do they? Do they spring up and go to the sink? No, they're going to take their time. If they're sitting there doing something, maybe they're reading a book, and you say, it's time for dinner, come on, come eat. A lot of times, just a minute, as soon as I finish this page, right? Depending on how hungry they are, of course. But they'll, okay, be there in a minute, let me finish what I'm doing here, and then we'll be there, and then they make their way to the dinner table. If you say, let's go get some ice cream, they'll spring up like Bartimaeus did, and they'll beat you to the door. Right? So depending on the motivation, there are different ways to get up. Well, Mark tells us that Bartimaeus got up like he was shot out of the cannon. Right? He jumped up, shed his garment, got up, and right away. As soon as Jesus called him, Bartimaeus was there. That's how Jesus wants us to respond. When he calls us to do something, he wants us to do it. He wants us to spring into action. Not, okay, yeah, as soon as I get all these other things done on my priority list, then I'll come do whatever it is you want me to do, Jesus. No, he wants what he says to be the top of our priority. He wants us to spring up and spring into action. Third, Bartimaeus knew exactly what he needed from Jesus. When Jesus asked Bartimaeus, "What do you want from me?" he said, "I want my sight." Bartimaeus knew he had a need in his life, and he knew that Jesus was the only one who could meet that need. You know, we need to take a self-assessment of our life. So many times we go to Jesus and we just kind of give these generic prayers. Oh, bless me, God. God blesses you all the time. What specifically do you need? God wants our prayers to be specific. He wants us to ask for a specific need. What are those needs in your life that only Jesus can meet? That's what Jesus wants you to bring to him. You know, if it's something you can do on your own, you don't need to ask Jesus about it. He wants us to examine our life and see there are so many needs in our life that only he can meet. A good part of us taking him to him is the fact that we recognize that. That's part of the process is in order for us to ask Jesus what we need to know what we need. So disciples know what it is we need that only Jesus can fulfill. Finally, Bartimaeus showed gratitude. You know, after Jesus healed him, he didn't selfishly go his way. You know, if we look at all of the miracles that Jesus did, all of the healings that Jesus did, most of those people, they went off back to their life, never to see Jesus again. But Bartimaeus was grateful, and he faithfully followed Jesus. Bartimaeus went from having a need to going to Jesus with that need, being grateful that for Jesus meeting that need, and then becoming a loyal follower of Jesus. That's the process that we all go through to become a true follower of Jesus. We go from having a need to desperately taking that need to Jesus, having him meet our need, and then gratefully following him, faithfully following him. At least that's the way we should do it. Sometimes we shortcut that. We take our need to him, and then we go back to doing things our own way until there's another need. But no, Jesus wants us to be like Bartimaeus. Yes, bring him your needs, the needs that only he can meet. But when he meets them, be grateful and be a loyal follower of Jesus for the rest of your life, not just when you need him, when you think you need him, but be a faithful follower for the rest of your life.